Hey, South Coast, this is Jeff Santos. Join me for Populist Progressive Talk weekdays, 3 to 6 p.m., right here on WVBF AM 1530. Welcome back. It is indeed the Jeff Santos Show that you're tuned into. We're here every Monday through Friday, 3 to 6 p.m. We urge you to tune in, tell your friends. You can listen online, hometowntalkradio.com, of course, revolutionradionetwork.com, and here at AM 1530 in southeastern Massachusetts. Our next guest comes to us from 3,000 miles away from the Pacific Northwest, where the salmon run wild, and the Mariners play baseball, and the Seahawks are on their way to the Super Bowl. That's my prediction.
Marshawn Lynch running in beast mode. He's gonna rock your world, gonna carry that load. Superhuman strength, he can carry the whole team. He don't talk much, he's a mean machine. Richard Sherman's gonna stand.
It's time to talk to Mark Taylor-Canfield. Mark, how are you, sir? Happy New Year.
Running in beast mode, he's going to carry that team. He's going to carry the load. Yeah, I have a song. Russell Wilson, the new kid in town, is the smartest quarterback in the NFL.
Russell Wilson, the new kid's in town. He can run it, he can pass it for another touchdown. The smartest athlete in the NFL. He's always ice cool, so he cannot fail.
That's a song I did at YouTube just for fun. I mean, we were just having fun. I understand with all the other things going on in the world that, there are other issues that are much more important than professional sports. So, yeah, go Seahawks. I said, don't count them out after the major grudge match with San Francisco because you can't keep the Seahawks down. And when you got a coach like Pete Carroll who gets up every day like a 12-year-old kid ready to go do his favorite hobby for the day and ride his bicycle all over town. He kind of reminds me of the kid that I grew up with. He used to ride his bicycle like 2 miles a day or something. He's just got so much energy, and he's so positive, and he really does kind of allow the players to be their own individual selves. Like you were just talking with Melissa Tomlinson from Badass Teachers about how the standardized testing kind of turns students into robots. Well, I think sometimes professional sports can do that to people too. So when you have people like Marshawn Lynch and Pete Carroll and, previously Richard Sherman on the team, they kind of shake things up because they're sort of a new breed and a new way of looking at things. We are 3,000 miles away from the Beltway and that Eastern establishment, so we got a little different style out here.
I love it. I think we should have more Seattle in the rest of the country, and that's why we have you on every week, because we need to get the Seattle fix into the rest of the country. I think that's important because if you look at where the state of America is politically right now, it's god-awful. I mean, we're in a situation, as we talked earlier with Larry Korb and Robert Craig, about where Donald Trump is taking this country, the possibilities. I mean, it is hard, and so I think it's important for people to have a safe relief valve, whether that is sports or music. I mean, not to be disengaged. We want people to be engaged, to be involved, to vote, to protest. I was watching last night the Colbert Show, and Jane Fonda, yes, that Jane Fonda of the 1960s, is moved from L.A., where she has lived and obviously worked in Hollywood for years, to Washington, D.C., to work with young environmentalists to talk about climate change, and they get arrested. Kudos to Jane Fonda.
She's back. Barbarella is back.
Exactly. And, I just think that that's an important facet of all this because, my God, if you don't get engaged and involved, you allow the Trumps and the McConnells to run the day and ruin the day.
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, people in Seattle, they like the Seahawks. They love the Mariners, even if they lose all the time. But people here have other things on their minds. It's not, for the people that are active in the community activists, the city council members, the new council members that just got elected this last year, they're looking at other issues rather than professional sports. I know that our mayor, Jenny Durkin, is former attorney under the Obama administration. She actually loves soccer, and so she is pushing this idea that Seattle members of the Seattle team are going to be on the World Cup team. We're going to have a national team. We're going to compete with the rest of the world. So watch out. I mean, the women have done it, so maybe. I'm not saying no to that. I think she's a little bit ahead of the game. Her and Kerry, the guy that owns the comedian that owns the team, with some of the other owners, I think they're a little bit ahead of themselves. But it's good to hear somebody say, we are going to be America's soccer city, and we just won the MLS last year, and there are a lot of people who play soccer here. There are also a lot of people from other parts of the world who move here, where soccer is incredibly important to their culture, and so
it's the world sport.
I've talked about Juliana she's from Sao Paulo, Brazil, one of our favorite people in Seattle, and she can play soccer in her high heels. I'm not kidding you, Jeff. I've seen her do it. So some people just grow up with soccer. In Seattle, I think we grow up with music, because although I have to tell you there were no fireworks off the Space Needle this year, which is the tradition, it's always in the tradition in Seattle. We get together at my friend's apartment up on Capitol Hill, up on the roof for a big rooftop party with all the residents of the building and friends, and we watch the fireworks. Well, this year, Seattle decided, that fireworks are not great for the environment. They're kind of dangerous. They also cause a lot of problems where I remember dating this girl once whose dog would run away every 4th of July because it was so freaked out by the fireworks.
Dogs don't like fireworks. That I can attest.
You have to spend the next 24 hours looking for that. But in Seattle, I think people like to go out to clubs. And so actually, New Year's was pretty fun here, because even though I do have this culture clash issue going on, Jeff, about people paying, $400 or $500 to have New Year's Eve in an exclusive 4-star hotel with red carpets and, showing all their bling. There's more and more of that happening.
Is that just the friends of Jeff Bezos and Schultz and everybody else there? That's Gates. Is that what these folks do? That's New York prices, for crying out loud.
No, it's more like a new thing. I think it's a lot of it is generated by young professionals who have moved here and are making a lot of money and don't have families yet or a lot of expenses and not buying a house, so they have a lot of money to throw around. They're enjoying themselves, and what they do is they have events called, and the theme of the event is called Ego, or you have events where it's like a red carpet event, or even the Stranger Magazine, which is supposed to be the alternative, magazine in Seattle. Their event costs, I think $300, $275 for a ticket. And for I think the cheapest ticket was like $90 or something. And they didn't even let people go outside to see the light show on the Space Needle, because now we've decided in Seattle, instead of having fireworks, we're going to do laser light shows off the Space Needle, which is kind of cool. I mean, that's kind of rock and roll. That fits with Seattle and the Experience Music Project and a Museum of Pop Culture, which is right there by the Space Needle. Well, that's actually where this party was, this New Year's Eve party, and it was called Indulgence. And to me, it was just ridiculous. People didn't even go outside to watch the laser show. They saw it from inside, a block away, Jeff, on a video screen. Like, I'm not going to pay for that. I'm sorry.
No, I wouldn't either.
We go out to my friends' clubs like the Rebar or Cremwork. I mean, Rebar is owned by my friend Dane Garfield Wilson. He's been a big-time DJ and music club promoter in Seattle for a long time, big supporter of the Bernie Sanders, the clubs and bands and DJs for Bernie when he was running in 2016. I think that one night they raised, like $15,000 or something. And Cremwork, which is also kind of a cool club. It's kind of more Seattle style, but actually has a little Berlin style, because I believe the owner's girlfriend, they were originally living in Berlin, so they came here and kind of started what's considered a safe underground kind of club where, there's not going to be any homophobia, sexism, racism going on in those places. So that's a cool place to go when you're in Seattle. And then I can charge you $275, Jeff. They might charge you $10.
Well, I mean, I went to 3 bars.
Put you on the guest list like they did with me and my friends.
There you go. I mean, I hang around with cool people like you. I'm going to go places. I know that. We're talking with Mark Taylor-Canfield here. He is the Renaissance man. He is a man of Seattle. Every Tuesday on the Jeff Santos Show at this time at 5:30 Eastern Time, 2:30 Pacific. I want to ask you this, because I've been thinking about not only how Seattle is the first, California gets that designation. I know there's a rivalry between the two cities, San Francisco and Seattle, and of course the states of Washington and California. But if you think about this, not only did you lead recently on the minimum wage, not only do you lead on the environmental concerns and Jay Inslee's work there, but I'm thinking about music, great guitar players. You think of Jimi Hendrix. You think of a lead singer, Sisters, in Heart in the 1970s. There's a lot of pushing out what is not accepted by mainstream America and making it become mainstream. I think that, to me, is really something to... you're in the music world a lot more than I am. But I was just thinking about that. There's just two that came to mind, from the late 1960s and Hendrix and Hart in the 1970s. And really trailblazers.
Well, Jeff, I'm writing a book. I'm writing several, but I'm writing a book about some of these crazy eccentric people that you meet in Seattle. And even with all of this corporate gentrification going on and Jeff Bezos declaring him, head of the universe or whatever, there's still a lot of really great underground, really creative, eccentric people who are, maybe they're not living in huge flats like they used to or owning their own homes, but, they're surviving in the city. And so the rooftop party that we go to, that guy actually, Keith, has his own cookbook called What Would Gandhi Eat? And it's a vegan cookbook. And he also competes in the World Mustache and Beard competition every year. And he's very serious about it. Those are the kind of people you still meet in Seattle who are just very eccentric. We just did an art project about our friend Purple Mark, and he just usually dresses in one really bright color from head to toe. So his hat, his fingernails, his hair, his beard, all of his clothes, shoes will be one color. He's a very eccentric character who's kind of like a local wizard who writes fantasy novels and is at every great party and every great show. The Fremont Arts Council that I've been a member of are all basically a bunch of aging hippies who moved here from San Francisco or the East Coast back in the Summer of Love in those days and have kept this sort of actually more like a Celtic or pagan kind of traditional life where they do the solstice celebration.
Oh, yes,
and May Day and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of great stuff going on here. Now, the problem is that we also have to address what's going on in the rest of the country, and that means, and we're by no means perfect here. I mean, we obviously had problems with racism and excessive use of force by the police department and all sorts of things in the past in this town that we're still trying to fight. But at the same time, we also have these protests like most of the rest of the country on Saturday. And that was organized by Code Pink and other groups, and that was what they would call an unpermitted march, Jeff, which is why the right for people to peaceably assemble and address their government for grievances, which is ensconced in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, along with press freedom, by the way. That's why it's so important, because on Saturday, people needed to respond. They needed to get out in the streets, and there was no time to go to the city and ask for a permit and see if they can, get a parade route lined up. No, people are going to take to the streets, and they're going to go to the Westlake Park, which is a traditional protest area in Seattle, and then down at Victor Steinberg Park at Pike Place Market, and just stand in solidarity with all the rest of these people around the country and around the world who are saying, we're tired of endless wars, okay? Afghanistan, did we learn nothing from Vietnam? Afghanistan, Iraq, I mean, come on.
On and on and on.
We do not want to send our young people across the seas. We do not want to see civilians being killed. We do not want to see more mass migrations of population. Come on. Let's get over this idea that military is the way that you solve your problems in the world. That's kind of what people were saying on Saturday here.
I can imagine. Is there a significant Muslim or Arab American population in Seattle?
Yes, I mean, there's actually, because of the major corporate recruiters in Seattle, there are people from all over the world.
Sure.
So you have maybe Muslims from Indonesia and South Asia, you might from India, and just all over all the African countries too. Some are majority Muslim. So yes, there are Muslim families that live in my neighborhood, and that's Seattle, and that's good. I think for a long time it was a typically white-dominated part of the country, and this influx of people have many different points of view and many different vested interests in what's going on around the world. So I'm hoping that will continue to lead to more diverse politics, and also just this. I remember Jerry Brown, right? Wasn't he the one who? I'm just trying to think. It was Jerry Brown who started the idea of starting a Department of Peace in the federal government.
Yes, I think it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, John Kennedy said we got to put an end to war. I mean, he said it himself. He knew. And so people need to calm down, cooler heads need to prevail, and hopefully some kind of peace and justice will prevail around the world because, 2020, we're supposed to have better vision this year, right?
I would hope.
Maybe
let me ask you.
Policy that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that until November. But you have a guy who's a narcissistic, only concerns about himself, individual who is completely out of control, in my opinion, and is now in a reckless phase.
Well, I mean, people were scared when Reagan was elected. They really, they were scared of Bush. I mean, some of these people on the right very pro-military are the ones who get us into these invasions.
Oh, yeah.
Although, you know, we have to admit it was a Democrat with LBJ that got to Vietnam to that extent. But, yeah, there's a certain uneasiness with militarism for sure. And when you look at also I'm thinking that cooler heads will prevail, and I'm also thinking that people are pretty much tired of politics as usual. So there's going to be a new type of foreign policy, I think. In the United States, we have this problem with the oligarchs. So it's not just our country. You know, Russia is also dealing with other countries. But the fact that all these billionaires are trying to run everything, and that you have a culture that's really suffering from that mentality, which is why we have a president like we do, then, you know, we really need to re-examine our values as a culture, as a society. What do we really stand for? Do we stand for democracy? Do we stand for justice and peace? Or are we going to be a destabilizing force in the world? And that's not our role. Our role is to create a peaceful world that John Kennedy and others have envisioned. And I think, you know, people in Seattle still believe that. We still believe that we're on the vanguard of a new way of looking at things, a new century. I keep waiting for the 21st century to hatch. I think we're a little late.
20 years late,
We're still kind of living a little bit like the 19th century, but I'm hoping people will get over it. And as you see these new political movements happening all over the world and in the United States, I think there's a lot of hope that younger people are just not going to put up with this crap anymore. And if you want a good example of that, just look at, you know, Greta Thunberg.
I was going to say, took the words out of my mouth, Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, is it in your mind that we are seeing, you know, the poll numbers go up for Bernie, number one, tied in number one at 23% in CBS YouGov poll, and at 20, he's 2 points ahead. We talked to David Paleologos, greatest pollster in the country, yesterday. He says all the trend lines are very good for Bernie, plus the fact is that there are a lot of people who are voting for the first time for Senator Sanders that may not show up in a lot of these polls because they're not using the variables that show new voters. So, you know, it looks good at this point for Iowa, and I think February 11th for New Hampshire. But, you know, this is now a good vibe. Now, is there a sense when you talk to some Bernie supporters there, you know, that they have captured the imagination of a lot of people, not just young people, because when you think of the old-line politicians, you get two of them in the United States Senate, in both Cantwell and Patty Murray, you know, who once considered, at least Murray was, a reformer. Now they're sort of status quo. How's the feeling there about Bernie and about those who are sort of, you know, yesterday's news?
Well, one, I mean, don't be surprised, because we were all surprised by the election in 2016. You less than some of the rest of us, Jeff. I have to give you credit for that. Because I remember you calling me just before and saying, Mark, I think Trump's going to take it. And you saying, I don't want to hear that.
Yeah. Well,
but we now have a situation where what we need is a president who is a potential Nobel Peace Prize winner, not a TV reality star. So if we can get somebody like Bernie Sanders in there, who is that kind of guy, I think we could really calm things down, and we could work towards some peaceful resolution of a lot of our issues. The problem here, Jeff, for the militarists is that when you destabilize the world to that degree, it also destabilizes economies around the world, and that then eventually hurts the defense contractors and the people depending on. So, you know, it's not good for, it's not always good economically, you know, for that kind for military action to be the response. I would also point out that in the beginning, Donald Trump was actually one of those candidates who was saying, you know, he was kind of sick of the whole endless American war thing. So, you know, if he wants to stick to his original principles, he should make sure that we don't end up causing such unrest around the world, and also that we don't end up sending our sons and daughters again, you know, into some foreign theater, because we should be concentrating on what's going on right here, right now in our country. And those issues of, you know, some of the issues I work on, like freedom of the press, a lot of the issues economically with healthcare insurance and education. I mean, the schools falling apart. You've been talking with Tomlinson from Badass Teachers, who's a great spokesperson for teachers around the country, and also
fantastic.
Great. They know what's going on, and unfortunately, because of the kind of top-down corporate way that the government's being run, they haven't had their voices heard at the top level the way they should.
Neither have our nurses who are, sponsors of this program at Mass Nurses Association. You're so correct. Interestingly enough, those two professions are probably more behind the candidate of change, the real change, and Bernie Sanders. Both National Nurses United and the recently UTLA have been endorsing the Sanders campaign as an example in the West Coast. I want to ask you in our remaining minutes here. We always talk about this. The fact is that if you can really believe it in Seattle, and I'll give our friends to the south in Portland and less so San Francisco these days because it's all corporate, but that Cascadia world, if you want to call it, can include our brothers to the north in Canada and British Columbia, that's where it has to start and then move its way east. And I think that's a really critical component of this. And we saw it actually in 2016. I mean, all of those parts, with the exception of California, which they fixed the vote. They announced that Hillary won the state of California the day before the vote. I mean, that's just insane, but that's how things ran in 2016 with Debbie Wassermen-Schultz as the head of the party back then. There's a certain pride, is there not, in Seattle about being the first, about pushing the envelope on what is mainstream and what eventually becomes mainstream. I mean, it's a grunge movement as from, day one.
Well, hopefully, I think that's still happening in the music scene here with my friend Eva Walker's band, The Black Tones, and Shayna Shepherd and Barracks. By the way, two very powerful black women leading those bands. I think that what we should do is be the leader towards dealing with the climate issue, because we laud ourselves as being the green, not just because of the marijuana, but green part of the country where it is literally, at least where I live, very green. I mean, it's a very beautiful part of the country. Although it's raining cats and dogs right now, but you can tell people that actually.
Yeah,
but
it's always sunny in Seattle, right?
Yeah, it feels like we're the last frontier on that kind of attitude. And so I would like to see people like Jay Inslee, and I know Pramila Jayapal, our Congresswoman, has her hands full with healthcare and education and impeachment and so many other things. But it would be really great if we could be and should be actually the leader of the green movement, because we have this consciousness here about, and this goes for at least, most of Western Oregon and Northern California especially, is we really love the environment here. It's beautiful. It's such a wonderful, wonderful place to live. And you go from the sequoias to the redwoods, and then, the Douglas firs and cedars in my part of the country, the mountains, the Puget Sound, the oceans. The Puget Sound is an inland ocean. It's referred to as the Salish Sea. When I was out there with the Greenpeace ship, following the orcas, trying to figure out where the oil tankers were going to be going. For the.
Yeah. By the way, I want to get this out.
It was beautiful. I'll never forget that.
Yeah,
and it makes you reacquaint yourself with why the environment is so important and why we each individually have to fight to raise people's consciousness and work with the students that are walking out.
Here is Greenpeace as connected with our good friend Jane Fonda, and they're involved in this whole element. So, just to make sure you're aware of that if you're not already.
She was also in Seattle and was instrumental in helping to reclaim Fort Lawton as a tribal center in Seattle. She was here as part of that sit-in. So we have a history with Jane Fonda here. And also her boyfriend at the time, who became a state senator
Tom Hayden,
in California. Yeah, I've talked to him several times because he's also been in the Northwest. He was here during the WTO demonstrations in 1999.
Mark, it was so great. I mean, it is so good to have you on to start the new year. Best to you, and we'll look forward to again doing next Tuesday. And so much going on, and we'll talk to you then. All the best, my friend.
Best progressive show in the country, Jeff. Keep it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, Mark. Best progressive and Renaissance man in Mark Taylor-Canfield. And check him out, Daily Kos, and a bunch of other great periodical, Democracy Watch News, etc. Check him out on Twitter, too. All right, Mark Taylor-Canfield is our last guest of the day. My name is Jeff Santos. I want to thank Bob for doing a great job producing the broadcast today. Thank you for listening. Keep on fighting, folks. Please. Keep on fighting. We need all of you in this fight. My name is Jeff Santos. Right now, it's my time to say, I gotta go. The Jeff Santos Show is brought to you by the Massachusetts Nurses Association, the most powerful and effective voice on nursing and healthcare in Massachusetts. With more than 23,000 members, including the nurses throughout the Southeast region, the MNA is committed to securing access to quality care in all healthcare settings, with safe staffing levels and healthcare policies that ensure every patient has access to the care and attention they need when it matters most. To find out more about MNA, visit massnurses.org. Hey South Coast, this is Jeff Santos. Join me for Populist Progressive Talk weekdays 3 to 6 p.m. right here on WVBF AM 1530, Taunton, Middleborough.
Listening to the voice of Southeastern Massachusetts for news, sports, and talk. AM 1530 WVBF and FM 2599 DD 99.7 Middleborough, Taunton.
USA Radio News with Tim Berg.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Iran is undermining peace efforts in war-torn Afghanistan.
Iran has refused to join the regional and international consensus for peace and is, in fact, today, actively working to undermine the peace process.
Pompeo, talking with reporters at the State Department, also says that General Qasem Soleimani was responsible for enormous destruction in the volatile Middle East. Senate Republican leaders are preparing to move forward on a set of impeachment trial rules. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is on the verge of having sufficient backing in his 53-member caucus to pass a blueprint for a trial that leaves the questions of seeking witnesses and documents until opening arguments are made. That trial would mirror former President Bill Clinton's trial, which is something that Senator McConnell has said he hopes to do. And you're listening to USA Radio News. As tensions in the Middle East remain high, many folks are keeping an eye on oil prices. With the details, here's USA Radio Network's Chris Barnes.
Global markets are worried about oil supplies due to increased tension between the U.S. and Iran. Investors are concerned about the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway linking the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean. That checkpoint sees about a fifth of all global petroleum consumption pass through there each day, roughly 21 million barrels of oil daily.
This is USA Radio News. Researchers at San Francisco State University believe many of us may be addicted to the constant pings, chimes, and vibrations and other alerts that come from our devices and are unable to ignore new emails, text, and images. USA Radio Network's John Clemens has more on the story.
If that got your attention, you might be one of the people Dr. Eric Pepper has reported on in a new study published in Neuroregulation. Pepper believes overuse of smartphones is like any other type of substance abuse, even opioids. In the survey, it was found those who used their phones the most reported higher levels of feeling isolated, lonely, depressed, and even anxious. It's believed that loneliness is partly a consequence of replacing face-to-face interactions with a form of communication where signals like body language cannot be interpreted. I'm John Clemens.
And finally, if your New Year's resolution is to avoid procrastinating when it comes to filing your income taxes, your time is coming up. According to the IRS, people can start filing their federal returns as early as January 27th. The deadline for filing is still April 15th, but early filers can start getting their numbers ready now. When it comes time to file, IRS Commissioner Charles Redding says the IRS is encouraging everyone to consider filing electronically and choosing direct deposit. For USA Radio News, I'm Tim Berg.
And, he's touting how much he improved healthcare in New York City and how many more patients were reached and how the infant mortality increased. So it's definitely a concern if he tries to call up those fears that people have of Bernie's stances as being too strong. We get out of the commie comments and socialist. People still don't understand exactly what that means. So it would be very easy for him to tap into that and kind of drive some of that messaging.
Yeah, very concerning. I'm going to keep an eye on that and obviously, speak truth to power on that issue. We're talking with Melissa Tomlinson here on the Jeff Santos Show. One of the other issues that I think that people always need to be aware of is this over-testing. And I think, as we now look at, again, an election year, and I know that there was a debate on MSNBC, or it's more of a forum than it was a debate on education. But to me, the idea of expanding the student's mind, to me, is so critical, because I know when I was in school 30, 40 years ago, one of the things that really I despised was people who just memorized everything. They might have been aiming to get an A. That was their whole game plan, but they never really understood the subject matter at hand. And I remember raising my hand when it came to history and social studies and political science eventually. And people looked at me like, I want to get this guy out of class. I just want to get the A and move on. And I think that, when you do these overemphasis upon standardized tests, you magnify this issue. And I think that goes against the idea of creativity amongst the individual student, and then later in life about, thinking about questioning authority, whether it's, your boss or questioning political power or whatever the case may be. Talk to me about that, because if you're forced as a teacher, to teach the test, and you spend, as one New Mexico teacher once told me, 70% of her time was focused on teaching to the test, you're basically making that child a robot. We don't need robots. We get enough of them that are actual robots that are taking jobs of millions of Americans. Your thoughts?
It's probably the most dehumanizing thing we see in society right now. To not be able to let a child explore what's in their own mind and grow from that. Mm-hmm. As we're, and I'm going to say it's more than 70%. When you look at it overall in a curriculum, just about everything you do is to teach that test, because the tests are tied to so much, right? We want to have these high-stakes accountability, and we keep getting threatened that if you don't have a high enough participation rates in the test, your schools aren't going to get the money that they're supposed to get. So you don't have the time to build a relationship with the child in the classroom because the class sizes are so large, like we spoke about earlier, and B, because you have so many facts and standards that you have to get through and benchmarks to meet. And the dehumanizing effect that it's having on children it's a red flag crisis as we watch the suicide rates go up, as we watch the violence in schools go up, as we watch the amount of teachers that are doing a silent strike and they're leaving the profession. And it's probably one of the most difficult things to come to grips with as a teacher, because not only deep down in your heart, but from learning educational theory as you got your master's degree going through school that this is not how it's supposed to be. And this goes against every tenet of educational practice that you studied, that the greats imparted with all of their research. And it's really hard to walk that line and to balance in the stress of bringing humanity to the classroom and trying to push aside the curriculum and the test as much as you can. It weighs down on you every day.
No, it certainly does. And to me, this is such a critical component of how we raise children, how we ask them, to think for themselves, to make decisions, to question, as I say, authority, which is a 1960s theme But the fact is that it's something that should be in everyone's vocabulary, because you need to understand what is being put before you. We were just talking with my producer earlier in the break about being in a hospital and having surgery done, and the doctor not telling you what the consequences are. You have to be able to challenge the authority figure, and that's something you learn, when you're a young person. If you're only focused on taking a test, and you got to know that this is this, and you got to make sure you circle A, and you got to circle it completely, otherwise the test will be, defaulted or whatever. I mean, it's just crazy thoughts that's how we want to raise a society. Your final thoughts, Melissa?
It is.
Okay.
And some people would kind of shy away of questioning the authority phrase, but it comes down to critical thinking, right?
Sure.
You want to be able to ask the questions and to think through things to get the information that you need as a human being.
I think it's so critical. Melissa, keep fighting. We will talk to you next Tuesday. Really appreciate your time. Sorry we had that little hiccup there. We'll make sure that is corrected as we move forward. All the best to you, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday.
Yeah, Jeff, and I do have that link for you real quick.
Okay, go right ahead.
B2020.me/Ed4Bernie. B2020.me/Ed4Bernie.
Ed for Bernie. Fantastic. We'll put that out as well. Thank you so much. And go Bernie, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much, Melissa. We'll talk next Tuesday. Take care. Thank you. Take care. Melissa Tomlinson, my name is Jeff Santos, and we'll take this time out. And MTC is on the way. He's on deck.
On White House stationery, accusing Democrats of conducting an illegal partisan attempted coup and of cheapening the importance of the very ugly word impeachment. A handful of moderate Democrats were reportedly pushing Pelosi to withhold sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate and keep them open for months in case further information is obtained. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has promised a speedy acquittal and refused Democrats' request that they be able to call new witnesses, including National Security Advisor John Bolton and Acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. "I'm not an impartial juror," McConnell said. "Everything I do during this, I'm coordinating with the White House counsel." What the editorial said: impeachment ought to inspire the utmost seriousness and patriotism from members of Congress, said the Washington Post. Instead, Senate Republicans have baldly declared that they intend to hold a truncated sham trial. If McConnell gets his way, crucial witnesses to Trump's alleged abuses of power may never be heard. The president's flagrant stonewalling of congressional authority may be allowed to stand. It's not the Senate's job to dig House Democrats out of the disaster their partisan zeal led them into, said New York Post. House leaders chose to rush the articles of impeachment to the Senate without hearing from key witnesses because they didn't want a lengthy court fight over subpoenas dragging impeachment into the middle of the 2020 campaign. Sorry, Dems, you don't get a do-over. What are Republicans afraid of? Asked the Houston Chronicle. If more evidence would fully clear Trump, the Senate GOP should welcome hearing from witnesses. A sham trial, on the other hand, would rob the president of a legitimate claim to the exoneration he says he deserves. What the columnist said. President Trump is clearly afraid, said David Graham in theatlantic.com. While he has insisted that impeachment is actually good for him politically, his apoplectic letter to Pelosi indicates he knows it's actually damaging him. A recent Fox News poll showed that 50% of Americans support impeaching Trump and removing him from office, and other polls are in the same range. Given the intensity of anti-Trump feeling, it's hard to imagine those voters voting for Trump next November. Impeachment isn't popular enough to be justified, said Andrew McCarthy in NationalReview.com. The House shouldn't even consider impeaching a president unless there is overwhelming public consensus for it, compelling two-thirds of the Senate to remove the president from office. The House's party line vote shows there's nothing close to that on the Ukraine scandal. By sending a case with no chance of conviction to the Senate, Democrats are trivializing impeachment, paving the way for a future in which routine impeachments and acquittals are just another feature of Washington's ceaseless partisan warfare. The founders never anticipated today's hyper-partisan politics, said Elizabeth Drew in the New York Times. The Constitution's framers believed that each branch of government would zealously guard its own power and independence. They never envisioned one party in Congress marching in lockstep to protect a president from accountability, much less Trump's almost cult-like hold over Republicans. Acquittal may shatter the last limits on Trump, said Ronald Brownstein in CNN.com. He will rightly conclude that Republicans will stand with him, almost regardless of what he does next, including soliciting foreign interference in the 2020 election. One party alone cannot defend the norms of democracy and traditional limits on the expansive exercise of presidential power. And a massive spending bill averts a shutdown. What happened? House lawmakers overcame bitter partisanship and impeachment this week to pass a nearly $1.4 trillion spending package that would fund the entire federal government through September 2020 and avert a government shutdown. The sprawling package, which does not include the roughly two-thirds of total federal spending that goes towards Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and debt service, capped months of furious horse trading between Republicans and Democrats to reach compromises on everything from border wall funding to the creation of a space force, a pet project of President Trump's. The Senate was expected to pass the bill after the week went to press, and President Trump had indicated he would likely sign it into law. The bill raises discretionary federal spending by about $50 billion over last fiscal year and will result in the second consecutive $1 trillion plus deficit. It contains wins for both parties, including $1.375 billion for President Trump's border wall with Mexico. That was far short of the $8.6 billion the president requested, although the spending accord preserved his ability to divert funding from other sources. Democrats won $10 million to create a new immigration detention ombudsman to inspect federal detention facilities and address complaints, $25 million in funding for gun violence research, the first security of state election systems, and a $208 million boost for the Environmental Protection Agency. The deal also raises the national age for tobacco sales from 18 to 21 and includes a 3.1% raise for both civilian and military employees. What the editorial said. The spending accord was cause for celebration and welcome proof that Republicans and Democrats are able to find common ground and get things done amid the impeachment drama, said the Columbus, Ohio Dispatch. Now, if only Washington politicians could extend this cooperative spirit to other efforts that deserve bipartisan support. Although, for the moment, we rejoice that the people's business can go on amid partisan rancor, civilian federal employees made out very well, said the Baltimore Sun. In return for giving Trump his coveted Space Force, Democrats won 2.1 million federal employees a well-deserved gift of 12 weeks of paid parental leave. Service members already have the benefit, but the much-needed paid time off is a boon for parents dealing with the birth, adoption, or fostering of a new child. What the columnist said. Creating a Space Force as the sixth branch of the U.S. military is a good idea whose time has finally come, said Jonathan Trugman in the New York Post. Global adversaries such as China and Russia are investing in space like never before, and private companies are already part of the new space race. The $13 billion budget for the force over the next 5 years will consolidate 15,000 service members, mostly from the Air Force, into a specialized organization with streamlined procedures that will open up a new field of advanced space engineering talent and let America compete and dominate for decades to come. And goodies like this don't come cheap, and they're just more evidence of the federal government's nonstop spending binge, said Maya McGinnis in thehill.com. The spending package is filled with budget busters, including $35 billion in special interest tax breaks, at least $25 billion in new spending gimmicks, and billions in unnecessary tax repeals. Adding to our already massive national debt of more than 23 trillion is no way to run a government. Looking at what didn't make it into this bill reveals a lot more of how hard it will be for the next Democratic president to push health insurance reform through Congress, said Paul Waldman in the Washington Post. Just consider a provision to ban surprise medical bills and to ensure hospitals are upfront about the cost of patient care was nixed despite support from lawmakers of both parties as well as the White House. At the same time, Congress repealed 3 health industry taxes initially introduced to pay for the Affordable Care Act. This is just one demonstration of the awesome lobbying power wielded by the healthcare industry, and it augurs badly for budgets to come. And in the What Next section, Republicans have good reason to get Trump's Senate trial over as soon as possible, said A.B. Stoddard in thebulwark.com. Rudy Giuliani continues to undermine claims of Trump's innocence, bragging this week that he forced the ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, because he needed her out of the way while pressuring Ukraine to investigate the Bidens. Federal prosecutors also revealed recently that Giuliani's associate, Lev Parnas, who helped him forge connections in Ukraine, concealed a nearly $1 million payment from Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian oligarch with ties to Russian organized crime. Republicans hope to be done with impeachment before any more news connects Russia money to President Trump. That's why Democrats ought to delay sending articles of impeachment to the Senate, said Will Bunch in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Why let a kangaroo court exonerate Trump? An indefinite delay allows Democrats to hold the trial over the head of the president for the rest of his term, providing a strong disincentive for him to commit the even worse crime during the campaign. And in the section, it wasn't all bad. Adam Armstrong today makes good money as a property investor, but he's never forgotten what it was like to grow up poor in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. So last week, the 35-year-old returned to his hometown of Harrisonburg, driving a 26-foot truck packed with $12,000 worth of toys. Wearing a Santa hat, Armstrong handed out 1,327 gifts, including dolls, Nerf guns, board games, and nearly 100 bicycles to delighted kids at 4 low-income housing complexes. You can't put a price on looking at these kids' happy faces, said Armstrong. A fruitcake sits at the center of Julie Rudinger's dining table every Christmas, but the Tecumseh, Michigan resident never eats a slice. That's because the cake is a 141-year-old family heirloom. Rudinger's great-great-grandmother, Fidelia Ford, had a tradition of baking a fruitcake and letting it age a year before serving during the holidays. But Ford died before her 1878 cake was ready, and when the holiday arrived, her family regarded it as a keepsake, not a dessert. Ford's descendants have looked after the rock-hard fruitcake ever since, showing it off at family gatherings and educating young relatives about its story. It's a great thing, says Ruttinger, 56. It's a legacy. And the special note here that this is going to be a pause for the week magazine. The next magazine won't be available until the week of January 17th. So don't look for a recording for it next week. And now, the controversy of the week. UK election. What are the lessons for the U.S.? British voters last week delivered a thumping victory for Boris Johnson's Conservative Party, finally guaranteeing Britain's long-delayed exit from the European Union. But Johnson's triumph also delivered a powerful warning to America's Democrats, said the Wall Street Journal in an editorial. Behind the unreconstructed socialist Jeremy Corbyn, Britain's Labour Party offered a radical left-wing agenda of taxes, spending, and identity politics to win back the white working class that flocked to Johnson's nationalistic Brexit movement in 2016. But this proved to be a colossal miscalculation, with Labour last week even losing some working-class seats it had held since before World War II. Heading into 2020, U.S. Democrats are poised to make exactly the same mistake, said Bret Stephens in the New York Times. The party's young, progressive thought leaders insist the best way to win back the white Rust Belt voters who elected Donald Trump is with far-left candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and radical policies such as Medicare for all, free college, and the Green New Deal. A strategy that will backfire here as spectacularly as it did in Britain. For Democrats to oppose Trump in 2020 with Corbynite candidates and progressive primal screams is to ensure his reelection. The U.S. is not the U.K., said Eric Levitz in nymag.com, and Bernie Sanders is not Jeremy Corbyn, a humorless oddball dogged by persistent charges of anti-Semitism. Corbyn is personally unpopular, and exit polls found that voters were rejecting him rather than Labour's left-wing platform. Corbyn is sui generis, said John Cassidy in NewYorker.com, and so is the Brexit morass. Corbyn bizarrely declined to make a position on the biggest issue in British politics, while Johnson's brilliantly simple promise, get Brexit done, promised relief to a nation exhausted by 3 years of Brexit uncertainty. His winning formula was tied to similar situation that is unique to Britain and which won't have any bearing on the U.S. election. You could have made the same argument about the original Brexit vote in 2016, said Roger Cohen in the New York Times. 5 months later, though, Donald Trump was elected by white working-class voters determined to take back their country from immigrants and the urban elites, just like the Britons who backed Brexit. 3 years later, the divided forces and the global left are still searching for a message that can compete with the populist right's fanatical singleness of purpose. One glimmer of hope, said Dan Baltz in the WashingtonPost.com, is that the exhaustion factor could cut differently in the U.S. than in the UK. British voters were desperate for an end to the uncertainty of Brexit, whereas many Americans are longing for an end to the volatility and chaos sown constantly by Trump. Democrats could learn a lot from Johnson, said Megan McArdle in the Washington Post. The key to his huge victory was pairing a Trumpian message of national greatness with a leftist promise of a massive investment in Britain's welfare state and a higher minimum wage. This combination of left economics and celebration of the nation state could be very popular in the U.S., too, said Andrew Sullivan in nymag.com. To adopt it, Democrats would need to ignore the woke, stop portraying America as rotten with racism, and adopt realistic immigration policies. A party that finds that patriotic sweet spot, as Johnson did last week, can harness the populist tide rather than being drowned by it. And in the Only in America section, a Republican lawmaker is asking that a newly cleaned statue of the Roman goddess Ceres not be returned to the dome of Missouri State Capitol. The statue of Ceres, goddess of farming, has stood atop the Capitol since 1924 as a tribute to the state's agricultural economy. But Representative Mike Moon says that because statues of Jesus are barred from public buildings, lawmakers should stand firm in our beliefs by refusing to honor a pagan god. And an Iowa man is denying any racist motive for surrounding his home with painted swastikas and Confederate flags. William Stark lives next to a school with a mostly non-white student body and has refused school officials' requests that he take down what they say is a racist display. They don't know their history, evidently, he says. And SCOTUS takes on presidential immunity. The Supreme Court agreed last week to consider whether President Trump can shield his finances from investigations, setting up a potential landmark ruling on presidential immunity during the 2020 campaign. The court will consolidate 3 cases about subpoena power, 2 involving House Democrats, the other involving New York City's district attorney, when it hears oral arguments in March ahead of an expected June ruling. Until then, the court stayed lower court decisions against Trump, so his tax returns and other financial documents will remain secret throughout the impeachment proceedings. Investigators are seeking records from Deutsche Bank, Capital One, and Trump's accounting firm, Mazars USA. In prior fights over presidential immunity, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled against Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. And in the section on the Good Week, it was a good week for they, which Merriam-Webster Dictionary named as its 2019 Word of the Year. While they has been in use as a popular pronoun since the 1300s, the dictionary was honoring its more recent meaning as a single person whose gender identity is non-binary. And it was a good week for oligarchy, after the Federal Bureau of Economic Affairs reported that through the third quarter of 2019, corporate taxes accounted for just 3.5% of all federal tax revenue, a sharp drop from 9% in 2010 and a 22% in 1960. And it was a good week for benefits for younger workers, with a report that the Audit Lab, a British marketing agency, allows its mostly under 30 employees to take hangover days in order to recover from nights out boozing with clients. Hangover days, the company said, help promote a trusting environment. And it was a bad week for male egos after JJ, a Japanese fashion magazine aimed at young women, earned global ridicule for advising its readers to flatter men by telling them they sound like Socrates whenever they say something complicated. And it was a bad week for carnivores after 2 inspectors from the Federal Food Safety and Inspection Service filed whistleblower complaints alleging that under new, looser inspection rules, the nation's pork will soon be contaminated with feces, toenails, sex organs, bladders, and hair. And it was a bad week for that awkward age, after middle school students were evacuated from a Florida school bus following reports of a possible toxic gas release. First responders traced the source of the odor to a single student who had doused himself with too much Axe body spray. And in the U.S. at a glance, Salt Lake City, uncharitable. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has stockpiled $100 billion in tax-free funds intended for charity, according to a whistleblower complaint revealed this week. David Nielsen, 41, a Mormon who until September worked in the church's investment division, Ensign Peak Advisors, told the IRS that Ensign Peak has not funded any charitable causes in 22 years. The church collects about $7 billion a year from members, then the complaint says. About $6 billion is said to cover operating costs, while the rest is invested by Ensign. In a statement, Nielsen said, "Would you pay tithing instead of water, electricity, or feeding your family if you knew that it would sit around by the billions until the second coming of Christ?" Church officials said the complaint relies on limited information under the IRS whistleblower law. Nielsen would share in any recovery that the agency made from the church as a result of his complaint. And in Frankfort, Kentucky, get out of jail. After losing his re-election bid in November, Republican Governor Matt Bevin issued a staggering 428 pardons before leaving office last week. One went to Patrick Baker, sentenced in 2017 to 19 years in prison for posing as a law enforcement officer and fatally shooting a man in a home invasion robbery. Baker's family held a fundraiser that raised $21,500 for Bevan, and Baker's brother and sister-in-law each gave an additional $4,000. In his pardon order, Bevan said the evidence against Baker was sketchy at best, to which sentencing judge David Williams said, "I've never seen a more compelling or complete case." Bevan also cited shoddy evidence when pardoning Micah Schlady, convicted of raping a 9-year-old, and Delmar Parton, convicted of murdering and decapitating a former lover. Kenton County prosecutor Rob Sanders called the pardons an absolute abomination. And in Port Washington, Wisconsin, swing state purge. A Wisconsin judge ordered the State Elections Commission to take about 234,000 voters off the rolls last week because they may have moved, drawing accusations of partisan gamesmanship in a critical swing state. Judge Paul Malloy, a GOP appointee, ordered the purge after the commission sent letters in October asking voters to confirm their address. More than 170,000 hadn't responded by December 5th. Another 60,000 letters were returned as undeliverable. The bipartisan commission wants to hold off on removing voters until 2021, but Malloy ordered it done well before the 2020 election. "It's not that difficult to do it sooner," he said. In a state President Trump won by fewer than 23,000 votes in 2016, Democrats note the letters disproportionately targeted liberal cities like Milwaukee and Madison. About 55% of the letters went to municipalities where Hillary Clinton bested Trump. And in El Paso, Texas, stop work order. A federal judge blocked the Trump administration last week from diverting $3.6 billion in defense funds to construct a southern border wall, citing legislative restrictions crafted by House Republicans in 2014 to curtail President Obama's powers. Those rules prevent a president from unilaterally moving to increase, eliminate, or reduce budget funds authorized by Congress, in Obama's case. Repurposing funds from the space program, U.S. District Court Judge David Briones said Trump had unlawfully sought to increase the $1.375 billion approved by Congress for border wall construction to $3.6 billion, and a federal judge in California ruled similarly days later. Briones did approve $2.5 billion shifted from separate Pentagon funding to wall construction as a counter-drug activity, although the Trump administration told contractors to stop wall construction to comply with a court order. It pledged to appeal the rulings. And in Washington, D.C., Mr. Comey regrets. Former FBI Director James Comey conceded this week he'd been overconfident about the Russia probe, saying there was real sloppiness in the surveillance of former Trump campaign aide Carter Page. Comey, who oversaw the probe before getting fired in 2017, accepted the findings of Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz that the FBI made 17 significant errors in its application to eavesdrop on Page. "He's right. I was wrong," Comey said. Asked on Fox News why he's been taking a victory lap since the report came out, Comey stressed that Horowitz found no evidence that the Russian probe was politically motivated. He said it was irresponsible of Attorney General William Barr to speculate that agents acted in bad faith. After the interview, Trump attacked Comey on Twitter, asking, "What are the consequences for this unlawful conduct? Could it be years in jail?" We now move to the world at a glance. Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan. Militia boss escapes. Afghan government forces turned the city of Mazar al-Sharif into a war zone this week, pounding the compound of a wanted ethnic Uzbek warlord with rocket-propelled grenades and fire from helicopter gunships. The assault killed at least 8 members of the Nazimud Qasari's militia, but the warlord himself sneaked away. Qasari is a former police chief who used his 100-strong militia to extort money from citizens. Arrested last year, he either escaped or was freed and relocated to Mazar-i-Sharif, a major economic hub. His latest getaway was a humiliation for President Ashraf Ghani, who this week publicly ordered the arrest of another strongman, General Zamari Pakan. Just hours later, Pakan posted a photo of himself on Facebook, posing in front of the Eiffel Tower. And in Harare, Zimbabwe, Second Lady accused. The estranged wife of Zimbabwean Vice President Constantinos Chiwenga has been charged with attempting to murder her husband. Prosecutors say former model Mary Mubewa, 38, tried to prevent a seriously ill Chiwenga, 63, from going to the hospital. When he was admitted, Mubewa allegedly ordered his bodyguards to leave the room, unhooked his IV, and tried to drag him from the ward before being stopped by security. Mubewa is also accused of spiriting nearly $1 million out of the country to pay for luxury cars and property, and of trying to fraudulently obtain an upgraded marriage license that would entitle her to more of her soon-to-be ex-husband's assets. She denies the allegations. Chiwenga played a key role in forcing President Robert Mugabe to resign in 2017 after 37 years in power. And in Nagaro, Japan, village of dolls. With birthrights falling and young people decamping for cities, many rural regions across Japan are seeing their populations dwindle and gray. The remote village of Nagoro is now entirely childless, so one woman has made hundreds of life-size cloth dolls to keep elderly residents company. Tsukumi Ayano, 70, created some 350 dolls that decorate the lawn, whose human population is fewer than 30, down from 300 when Ayano was young. The dolls sit in the empty school and in front of houses and stand propped in gardens. I wish there were more children because it would be more cheerful, Ayano told the New York Times. So I made the children. And in Islamabad, Musharraf sentenced to death. A Pakistani court this week sentenced the country's former military dictator, General Pervez Musharraf, to death for treason for his 2007 decision to suspend the Constitution and impose a state of emergency. Musharraf seized power in a bloodless 1999 coup and became hugely unpopular for his support of the U.S. war on terror. He sparked massive protests by firing members of the judiciary when they opposed him, including the Supreme Court's Chief Justice, and was toppled in 2008. The still influential Pakistani military said in a statement the verdict caused soldiers a lot of pain and anguish, and insisted that a man who served his country for decades can surely never be a traitor. Even if the sentence is upheld, Musharraf, 76, is unlikely to be executed. He is seriously ill and lives in self-imposed exile in Dubai. And in Beirut, violent protests. Dozens of people were injured in clashes between security forces and anti-corruption protesters in Beirut this week, with riot police hitting demonstrators with tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets, and being pelted in return with rocks and firecrackers. It was some of the most violent unrest since protests began in Lebanon 2 months ago, sparked by public anger at the ruling elite's self-enrichment amid the country's worst economic crisis in decades. Lebanon's infrastructure is crumbling. Garbage is piling up in the streets, and blackouts occur daily. Shiite groups in particular protesting this week, torching cars and burning tires, after a video circulated online showing a Sunni Lebanese man cursing Shiites. The crowds ignored the calls of the Amal movement, a Shiite political party, and the Shiite military group Hezbollah to stop protesting and go home. In Sydney, Australia, searing heat. Australia experienced its hottest day on record this week, with the national average temperature hitting a sweltering 105.6 degrees. Some places were much hotter, including the town of Ceduna in South Australia, where the mercury shot up to nearly 114 degrees. The record highs came as the nation continues to battle an extreme drought and raging bushfires that have cloaked Sydney in smoke. Suffering Australian lambasted Prime Minister Scott Morrison for taking a pre-Christmas vacation in Hawaii, with many slamming Morrison on social media with the hashtag, "Where the bloody hell are you?" a former tourism slogan. Climate scientists say Australia's soaring temperatures are linked to climate change, and activists have criticized the conservative Morrison for his refusal to wean Australia from its dependence on coal. And we now move to the people section. And how Hill became a victim of cyber exploitation. When Katie Hill entered Congress in January, the freshman Democrat seemed destined for great things, said Molly Jong-Fast in the dailybeast.com. But just 10 months later, the telegenic 32-year-old from California's swing district was forced to resign. A right-wing news site had published intimate photos revealing her and her husband's affair with a female campaign aide, and the House had opened an ethics investigation. An unlikely casualty of the hashtag #MeToo movement, the openly bisexual Hill says her career was wrecked by a bitter, jealous man. Her soon-to-be ex-husband, Kenny Heslop, before the 2018 election, Hill says she decided to divorce her toxic spouse. He threatened that if I tried to leave, he would ruin me. I had to anyway. She claims Hespet took and posted nude photos online without her knowledge, a charge he denies. The images were then picked up by the news site. While some commentators have called Hill a victim of revenge porn, she describes her experiences as cyber exploitation, because revenge porn implies you did something wrong, and that you made porn. Yet Hill can't help but feel shame. It's hard for me to reconcile how I was, and I think I still am, a role model for young women. And Harvey Weinstein thinks he's a feminist trailblazer despite sexual misconduct accusations from 80-plus women. My work has been forgotten, the disgraced producer told the New York Post last week. I made more movies directed by women and about women than any filmmaker. Weinstein, 67, cited the $10 million his studio paid Gwyneth Paltrow for the 2003 film View from the Top, claiming it was more than any man was paid by an independent studio at the time. I did it first, Weinstein said. I pioneered it. Days earlier, Weinstein said his bankrupt studio reached a deal to settle dozens of civil lawsuits for $25 million. 18 alleged victims would split $6.2 million, with the rest divided among other cases. It would be paid by an insurance company, not Weinstein, who would not be required to admit wrongdoing. He goes on trial on multiple counts of rape and sexual assault on January 6th. And Mongolia appears to have Donald Trump Jr. special treatment after he killed an endangered sheep on an August hunting trip. ProPublica.org reported last week. President Trump's eldest son shot a red deer and an agale, a giant sheep known for its 6-foot curved horns. He was granted an extremely rare permit to kill the sheep only after he'd left the mountainous region. Mongolia depends on the aid from the U.S. to keep neighbor China at bay, and Trump Jr., who was joined on his nighttime hunting expedition by government security officials and 5 American men, described as bodyguards or Secret Service agents, met afterward with Mongolian President Khaltmaglan Batula. Wealthy Westerners can buy permits for up to $55,000 to kill argali. The New York Giants released star cornerback Janoris Jenkins last week after he shrugged off calling a fan retard on Twitter. In response to a tweeted question from the fan about the Giants' disastrous season, Jenkins, 31, replied, "I can only do my job, retard." He apologized, but insisted the word isn't a slur for people with a developmental disability. "That is a slang I use back with my homeboys in the hood," said Jenkins, who's from Pahokee, Florida, has been picked up by the playoff-bound New Orleans Saints. And the meaning of Hanukkah. This is the briefing section. Once a minor holiday for observant Jews, Hanukkah has become a major celebration in the U.S. Why? What is Hanukkah? Hanukkah commemorates the rededication of the Second Temple in Jerusalem after a successful Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire in 160 BCE. Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals after the Macedonian Empire was divided upon Alexander's death, spread Greek culture, ideas, and religion throughout the ancient Middle East. The Jews were initially granted a measure of autonomy within the empire, but in 175 BCE, King Antiochus IV Epiphanes instituted a program of forced assimilation in Judea, outlawing the Jewish faith and desecrating the temple by sacrificing a pig and erecting an altar to Zeus. After a years-long campaign of guerrilla warfare, Jewish rebels known as the Maccabees defeated the Seleucids. Tradition holds that when the Maccabees recaptured the temple, there was only one vial of undefiled olive oil, enough to light the 7 lamps of the temple menorah for just one day. Miraculously, the lamps kept burning for 8 days, enough time to press and consecrate more oil. That's why Hanukkah is celebrated for 8 days and is called the Festival of Lights. How is it celebrated? Hanukkah begins on the 25th day of the Hebrew month of Kislev, which falls on December 22nd this year. But because the Hebrew calendar is on a different cycle than the Gregorian calendar, the holiday can begin anywhere from late November through December. Households gather together each night to light today's menorah, a 9-branch candelabrum, while saying the special blessings. The shamash, or attendant candle, is lit and used to light one other candle on the first night of Hanukkah, with one more candle added every night. Dreidel, a game of chance with a spinning top, is often played after the candles are lit, with the players seeking to win a small number of coins, nuts, candies, or trinkets instead of actual money. Foil-covered chocolate coins, called gelt, are often used. Each side of the top is inscribed with a Hebrew letter, Nun, Gimel, Hai, and Shin, with the letters standing for a great miracle happened there. Is Hanukkah a major holiday? For most of Jewish history, Hanukkah was considered a minor festival. The Hanukkah story does not appear in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, which is the basis of the Christian Old Testament. Unlike biblically established holidays such as Passover and Yom Kippur, Hanukkah has no special dietary restrictions and work is still permitted. The book of 1 Maccabees, which was written around 100 BCE, tells the story of the Maccabees' revolt and the 8-day celebration of the rededication of the temple, but it does not describe the miracle of lights, which first appears in writing nearly 600 years after the Maccabean revolt. Although Hanukkah today is one of the most popular and recognizable of Jewish holidays, the minds of non-Jews, this is only a relatively recent development, writes Tatiana Lichtenstein, director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas. For centuries, Hanukkah remained less religiously and culturally significant than almost any other of the Jewish holidays. When did that change? Hanukkah began to take on more importance in the mid to late 19th century amid large-scale Jewish immigration to the U.S. Many Jewish immigrants embraced the American customs as a way of fitting in, including Christmas, which during the Victorian era had begun its transformation into the highly commercialized holiday we know today. Alarmed by the number of Jewish families decorating Christmas trees and waiting for Santa Claus, religious leaders started to play up Hanukkah as an alternative. Cincinnati-based Reform rabbis Max Lilienthal and Isaac M. Wise are credited with popularizing Hanukkah by developing special Hanukkah synagogue services focused on children with candle-lighting songs and gift-giving, which they promoted in the Jewish press. We must do something, too, to enliven our children, Lilienthal wrote in an editorial in 1876. They shall have a grand and glorious Hanukkah festival, nicer than any Christmas festival. How has Hanukkah evolved since then? Hanukkah has become one of the most widely observed Jewish holidays in the U.S. because it does not involve many of the strict religious requirements of other holidays. It's become a way for secular Jews to express their heritage and identity during the holiday season. It is also a popular in the growing number of interfaith households which celebrate both Hanukkah and Christmas. Hanukkah has become a powerful public symbol of religious freedom. The New York-based Hasidic movement, Chabad Lubavitch, promotes public menorah lightings around the world, including the National Menorah in Washington, D.C. Hanukkah has also been growing in popularity in Israel, although it is not a national holiday. Hanukkah is a minor holiday that America has elevated into something much more, said Josh Plout, head rabbi at the Reform Metropolitan Synagogue in New York City. Jews have been part of that magnification of Hanukkah. It suits our purposes. And in a pullout, the commercialization of Hanukkah. Hanukkah sparks a seasonal debate in America over whether it's become too much like a Christmas. Kitschy products produced such as Elf on a Shelf have found counterparts in the Mensch on a Bench and the Maccabees on the Mantle. Kosher Foods manufacturer Manischewitz sells Hanukkah house kits that use vanilla cookies instead of gingerbread and come with blue and white icing. The Hallmark Channel this year added 2 Hanukkah-themed movies to its lineup of nonstop Christmas fare. In New York, you cannot go into a shop without seeing a menorah next to the Christmas tree. So people tend to think they are related, and Hanukkah is easily obscured by the holiday spirit, said Adam Goldman, a freelance journalist now living in Germany. Here I feel free to enjoy Hanukkah for what it really is, a secondary Jewish holiday. There's no commercial aspect whatsoever. We now move to some of the best columns in the country. The FBI's Abuse of Surveillance by David Garrow in the Wall Street Journal. Every American who cares about civil liberties ought to be deeply alarmed by the Horowitz report, said David Garrow in his investigation of the roots of the Russia probe. The Justice Department's Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, has shredded the credibility of the infamous Steele dossier and proven that his shoddy work played where he called a central and essential role in helping the FBI obtain warrants to surveil former Trump campaign aide Carter Page.